The quest to read 100 books in a year continues, and today we are going to go through some of the best and some of the worst books that I read in February. February was an up and down month. We got some good stuff, we got some great stuff, and we got some terrible stuff. So we're going to start with lowest rated and move ourselves to the highest rated. We're going to do a YouTube trick. So if you want to learn about the highest rated books, you got to watch the whole video, baby. Getting that watch time. As always, I have my handy dandy list down here, so that's what I'm looking at. I read a mix of physical books, Kindle books, and I listened to some audio books. I'll try to indicate which one was which, because I think that that does kind of have an effect on how much I enjoyed things. You know, oftentimes if the prose is good enough, if the story's good enough, if I like the characters enough, it really doesn't matter how I consumed it. But sometimes an author's words come to life with a narrator, or I like to have my own mental narration with a physical book or a Kindle book. So all books are wonderful. We are going to start at the bottom, which is Funny Story by Emily Henry. I did a full video review on this. If you want to check that out, I would encourage you to do so. Go ahead and click right here. I kind of go off the rails. I kind of have a crisis about literature in general, but I come to a pretty healthy place, I believe. Needless to say, I didn't enjoy this book at all. It's a 1 out of 5. A 1 out of 5 for me is basically I finished the book, but I absolutely hated it. Not really much good things to say about it. I would encourage you to click on that link and watch the full story, but that was probably the worst book I have read so far this year. Not because it's a terribly written book, but because it just didn't work for me in any way, shape, or form. My second 1 out of 5, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And I know, I hate going against the masses. Oftentimes, I fall in line with the masses, with beloved classic books. But for some reason, I do not understand why people like this book at all. I don't find it funny. I don't find it interesting. Frankly, I think it was a waste of my time. Now that's personal, obviously. Clearly, there is some merit to this book. It has spawned massive franchises, massive acclaim across all of the world. People smarter than me love this book. But what's funny is I watched this movie, the movie adaptation, when I was younger. Maybe I was 14, and I just hated it then. So I thought, okay, I'll read the book as an adult, and maybe I'll get a better understanding of it, or a better handle of it. Maybe the humor will come through that way. Well, it did not. I really didn't like this book at all. And it's kind of having a crisis, because I usually like the things that a lot of people like, but I guess my tastes are diverging a little bit more, especially with comedy. The comedy is just so subjective, and there are specific things that work for some people and don't work for other people, and this is firmly in that category. Another 1 out of 5 for me. Did not love it at all, but it's short enough that you get through it and you move on with your life. Next up, we have a 2 out of 5 for me, Jonathan Livingston Seagull. I read this one on Kindle. The last 2 I read on Kindle as well. Sorry, I said I was going to talk about that, and then I didn't. This was a Kindle read, so I got to, flip through the pages. There were some really interesting photographs of seagulls, because this book is about a seagull who just loves to fly and wants to be the best at flying. There's a philosophical narrative in there about being the best in your specific field, or attempting to be the best at what you are naturally talented at, and transcending kind of the mundane nature of life through the pursuit of excellence. So it's a solid, meaningful story. But I had gotten all that kind of covered by the Disney Channel original movies that I was watching when I was 9. So it felt a little redundant. I think culturally we live in a world now where that message is kind of drilled into us from a very early age. Be the best you can be. You can be anything you want to be. If you work hard, you can kind of, it becomes trite at a certain point. It becomes overdone. As a 18-year-old just starting college, fresh into the world, a little bit less cynical, a little bit less jaded maybe, I think I would have enjoyed this book a little more. It just felt like retreading a lot of stuff that I have already come in contact with media. And that's not the book's fault. That's, the world in which we live. I think this book was written a while ago, so maybe it's not as modern. The context in which things are written matter. This is a solid read if you are looking for maybe a repurpose. If you're trying to maybe change careers, or you're starting college, or you're starting a new job, and you're starting a family, and you want to kind of get perspective through a whimsical tale about seagulls, I think this could be valuable for you. Again, it's pretty short, and there's some cool pictures of birds. So it's kind of a win-win in my opinion. Next up, we have a really interesting entry because it's not something that I would normally read at all. And my rating is kind of based on that. It's Witchcraft for Wayward Girls, which by Gendry Hendricks. I should write the authors' names down, huh? Next month. 2 out of 5, 2.5 out of 5 for me. I don't like witchcraft books normally. I don't love horror books or movies. And I'm not a huge fan of the 70s, which is where this book primarily takes place. So with all that being said, I found myself kind of enjoying this. You know, it's definitely not for me. It is 100% not for me. It's a book about a house for unwed mothers in the early 70s. These group of girls entering into this house and finding a book about witchcraft, you know, hijinks ensue. It's an interesting social commentary. It's an interesting discussion about what these women went through. You know, usually a lot of them younger, a lot of them kind of down on their luck, poor socioeconomic status. Really interesting take on all of that. I found the witchcraft stuff to kind of be meh for me, but I liked kind of the historical aspect of it. That was really interesting. It's pretty well written. It moves well. The pace is good. But again, just not for me. If you really vibe with witchcraft in general, like witchcraft stories, this is for you. You will really like this. I think it does a credit to 1600 witches all the way up through the modern time, kind of how the witchcraft was viewed historically, all that stuff. There's really interesting portions about witchcraft throughout this whole thing. There's really interesting portions about, you know, giving birth and pregnancy. And I think having the perspective of just watching my wife go through it, you know, we've got a 5-month-old, so just watching her go through the whole pregnancy and the childbirth process in a modern context, you know, in a hospital, colored the way that I looked at this book and read it. And, you know, I would talk to her about some of the perspectives that were given in the book, whether that lined up with her perspective. So it was just an interesting kind of case study. So I'm glad that I read it. But again, one of those that I won't really be going back to. Haven't really been thinking about it very much. Didn't really stay with me at all, but probably because I was not the target audience. It was not written for me. So there you go. Next up, we have a physical book, The Film That Changed My Life, 30 Directors on Their Epiphanies in the Dark by Robert K. Elder. This was a really fun read. I gave it a 3 out of 5 because it was, you know, doesn't really have a ton of staying power. It's a fun read because it's interviews. It's interviews of directors, talking about the movies that either made them want to be a director, changed their lives. Every interview starts with what is X movie about, and just hearing them describe the plot lets you know how these movies really affected people. And as someone who has a history in the film business, who went to film school, I have a film degree. I love movies. I loved movies a lot more in the past. I've moved kind of away from movies. So to read about someone, 30 people, in fact, who still have that passion and have channeled that passion into creating their own is really interesting. So if you are a fan of movies in general, but specifically there's a lot of great movies, you know, The Godfather, Wizard of Oz, The Goonies, movies that I really enjoy and like, and to hear masters of their craft then talk about those movies was a really interesting thing. It's a book of interviews, so it moves really fast. You know, I'd read a couple while I was eating lunch. It was really fun. When we're talking about rating books, it's hard to give it anything more than a 3 out of 5. Good, solid, but not going to blow any doors off, you know? Book number 6, a Kindle book, Metamorphosis, Franz Kafka, 3 out of 5. It's hard to say anything about this book that hasn't already been said in a freshman philosophy class or in a literature class. It is a classic for a reason. However, for me personally, Kafka really isn't the person that I go to if I'm looking for a philosophical narrative. I'm more of a Dostoevsky fan in that regard. It's not one of the most Kafka-esque Kafkas. I mean, he's a giant cockroach, so that's really weird, yes, but on the whole, it's relatively tame for Kafka stuff. Metamorphosis, you know, it's about change. It's more so about the people around our protagonist who turns into a cockroach, a giant bug, whatever, and how they change, how familial obligation can change people. Could be an anti-capitalist propaganda piece, whatever you want, basically. I mean, it's all things for all people. There's a lot of different philosophical, structural, socioeconomic ways to read this book, and I think that that is why it firmly is a classic. Again, if I'm going for something like that, I'm reaching for, you know, Dostoevsky. I just prefer the Russians. I actually like The Trial a lot better. I feel like The Trial kind of says a lot more without also being a little bit boring. Like Metamorphosis is a little bit boring in its narrative. I don't have a literature degree, I don't have a philosophy degree, but this is how this book affected me. So there you go. I think everybody should read it. I really do think it should be on a list that a book that everybody should read. On a list of books that everybody should read is what I was trying to say. But I think there's value in it, and it's short enough that if you're trying to get into the classics, if you're trying to expose yourself to more philosophical narrative writing, as opposed to reading the same self-help books over and over again, you could find some very valuable info and valuable perspectives from this book. And in that same vein, another 3 out of 5, another Kindle read for me, The Stranger, Albert Camus, is again an important book that needs to be read, but also is kind of not losing its punch in the modern age. But these books were so new and so fresh, and they were written around a time period in which there was so much societal upheaval. There were world wars. There was just changes in social structure, the rise of communism as an ideal, as a practice. The context is so important, and so these books had their moment, and they had power in those moments, and there is still value today. These books have been iterated on and looked at in different perspectives and changed in different ways and retold in different formats, and so it doesn't have the same level that I think it did when you first read it in the late 40s, early 50s, whatever, when they first came out. Metamorphosis and The Stranger, I feel like, kind of fit in that same vein. So it's hard from a modern perspective to sit and criticize these works of great fiction outside of their proper context. I think this book is, again, very valuable. How many times have I said that? Books are valuable in general, man. Stop saying it. If you are trying to enter classics, trying to read a little bit more of the accessible classics, I mean, these are very easy to read just on the surface level, and then you can bring in as much philosophical or personal depth as you want to. My funny quip about this is, spoiler alert, but this could be a deep character study on nihilism and the absurdity of life, or it can be a story about a guy who killed someone because he got hot on the beach. Like, there are so many different things to bring to these texts, and I think The Stranger is important, hard to really justify giving it more than a 3 out of 5 for me because of the changing context, and the world that we live in now is different than the world in which it was written. 3 out of 5, 3.5 out of 5, Techno-Feudalism is the next book that I read. Yes, it's a very intimidating title, and it is what it sounds like. It is a book about the capitalist structure in which we live and how it is changing to what the author deems as techno-feudalism. It's a really well-written, interesting argument that I think is maybe not entirely valid, but still a very interesting thought experiment about how tech companies are basically the feudal lords of our time, and we are tech serfs, whether we work directly for those companies or whether we engage in the products in which they provide. It's a really interesting thought experiment. Obviously, this century is going to be dominated by how we as humans interact with burgeoning technologies, not just these social media and online shopping that are the focus of this book, but also AI. And nobody really knows the answer to that. And I think I like this book because it wasn't really prescribing this is definitely what's happening, but instead it was presenting an argument by what the author, he was the former economic finance minister of Greece, I believe. So he has been involved in economic politics, definitely coming at it from a leftist perspective, which I think is very valuable because it's an interesting way to not entirely be anti-capitalist, but instead take the fear-mongering away from a lot of the anti-capitalist rhetoric that we hear and move it more towards, no, we are entering into a completely different system of economics. We are no longer in the capitalist system. It's going to be more like feudalism, which I think was a very interesting take. Again, not sure I 100% agree with a lot of his arguments, but the argument is very well made. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, if you're interested in burgeoning technology or the socioeconomic status of the world, and you want a little bit of light reading, go ahead and check this one out. Techno-Feudalism was a 3.5 out of 5 for me. Really enjoyed it. Next up, we have a Kindle book that I read, Water Moon, 3.5 out of 5. And honestly, the more that I think about it, the more it creeps up to a 4. The only reason that it doesn't automatically have a 4 is that I really didn't like the ending, but obviously I won't spoil it. But it is, in the vein of magical realism. There's a lot of Murakami in here. It's a very, very well written love story. It's a very well written fantasy novel. There's so many different perspectives. It leans heavily on Japanese mythology, so it was right up my alley. It was things that I enjoy to read about, and the way that it was written was fantastic. I really, really liked this. I'm still thinking about it. I read this very early on in February, and it's still kicking around in my head. I'm going to do a full review video about it, so you subscribe to the channel if you want to see that. I think it was really, really good. It was surprising. I read it because Goodreads recommended it on like a challenge thing, and I liked the cover. So I love it when books, you just kind of take a chance and they reward you with some incredible prose and a really solid narrative and just, good characters. Overall, it was just really, really, really solid. So I really enjoyed it, and I think I'll probably bump the ratings up as we go. It might end up being a 4 out of 5, but we'll see. If I'm still thinking about it at the end of March, then it's definitely going to go up there. But Water Moon, really good stuff. If you enjoyed, Japanese fiction at all, give this a shot. Another 3.5 out of 5, The Greatest Night, which was a biography of William Marshall. I have done a full review video on that. Go ahead and click right here. This video is getting a little bit long, so I will just leave you with that. If you like medieval history, if you like knights, this is a great book for you. If you want more information, go ahead and check that video out. We got another 3.5 out of 5. We had a lot of 3.5 out of 5s. There was a lot of good reading done in February. This is Dread God. This is the Cradle series. I think this is the 11th book, the penultimate book. I really like this series. I don't know how much more I can talk about it. This entry felt more like setup for the final novel, but there was still a strong narrative within this book. It held its own in the larger series. If you're looking for a series that kind of mimics some power scaling animes like I talked about last month, I think that this is a great one. These move really, really well. A special shout out to Audible. Travis Baldry reads these. He's an author in his own right, but he is a fantastic voice actor, narrator. I do not think that I would like these books half as much as I do without his voices. So if you're going to take a stab at these books, I highly recommend you listen to them because his narration is fantastic. Stop me if you've heard this one before. 3 out of 5 for Mythos, which is book number 2 in the mythology series that Stephen Fry is doing. Kind of a modern retelling of ancient Greek myth, gods, heroes, Trojan War, and I think he's doing the Odyssey next. Last month I read Troy about the Trojan War. This month was Heroes. I kind of did them out of order because I enjoy the Trojan War a little bit more, and I did like that book a little bit more, but this one is still a really solid entry, going through each and every Greek hero, their trials, their tribulations, how it relates to, modern times, the stuff that's still around today. If you're a big fan of antiquity at all, if you're a big fan of history, ancient history, check these out. They are so incredibly readable. And again, if you want to listen to them, Stephen Fry's dulcet tones are going to talk to you about them, which I just think is a bonus. Moving into the 4 out of 5s to round this video out, one of my favorite books that I read this month, The Japanese Empire, Grand Strategy from the Meiji Restoration to the Pacific War. This is one of those books that I absolutely loved that I cannot recommend to you because this is some military history at its finest. And if you are not a military historian or a fan of military history, I can't really recommend this to you because you will absolutely hate it. But this is history as it is meant to be written. It is clear, it is concise, it is sourced incredibly well. Original language, primary sources from China, Korea, Japan. There is a mix of secondary sources on military history from some of the greatest military historians in the game. It reignited the passions that I had in college when I was studying history. I was an Asian and Latin American history major. So, this is my wheelhouse, right? And I think that this is such a fresh take on the Japanese Empire from the beginning of the 1900s to the fall of the Japanese Empire with World War II, how each decision stacked on itself to create this juggernaut of a military machine that then got a little bit too big for its britches and spiraled out of control and turned into the society that we know today. An empire that fought incredibly hard and to the last man. And not only the military strategy, but the social strategy that they put in place for the population to allow them to kind of do this, how they maneuvered the government. Really, really fantastic stuff. If you are a fan of military history, history in general, history of Asia, this is a great book for you. And it really, it's not that long at all. It's a short read, but it is really, really, really good. Another 4 out of 5, another book that I listened to on Audible, The Will of the Many, James Islington. I did a full review. Again, this video is getting a little girthy, so I'm just gonna say watch this review, and I will leave you with the fact that if you are looking for a modern fantasy novel that's gonna knock your socks off, this is one for you. I really, really, really liked this, and I highly recommend it. That will do it. Those are the 14 books that I read in February, from worst to best, in my opinion. I hope that you have your interest piqued by some of these books. If you have read some of them and you have a different perspective than I do, please leave that in the comments. I would love to hear from you. We are reading 100 books this year, so you should subscribe. For every month, we are going to, kind of give you an update, keep you abreast of where we are, while also doing full in-depth reviews, tier lists, all that jazz. So if it sounds like something that interests you, please subscribe. It would really mean a lot to me. Thank you so much for watching this video. Hope you're reading something really good right now. I will see you next time.